She Pled Her Belly by Jay Wilburn. Alice Crimson pled her belly, and that's why she lived while Captain Mad Red Crimson did not. Anyone looking at her could tell she was heavy with child. Some of the other women who were spared from the slaughter that Captain Jameson Stork called trials and executions were showing less. Being with child did not guarantee that there wouldn't be atrocities committed against them before this was all over. While the inland cottages burned and still smoked to her back, Alice faced out to sea at the tilted wreckage of her husband's ship. Stork's men, some of whom used to sail under the crimson banner, hoisted the heads of the executed men and women on the loose ropes of the wreckage. One of the cabin boys' heads slipped its noose and tumbled over the deck and splashed into the waves. The men laughed over the spectacle. They took extra care in knotting the end of Mad Red Crimson's severed neck in the ropes before they ran his head to swing from the mast. The sky sank into a soft orange as the sun set over the water. Her husband's eyes were bulged and lifeless. His long black hair and beard had been pulled out in patches long before he died. She could almost fool herself into believing that wasn't him. Her full belly cramped and she squeezed her eyes shut as she leaned against the bars at the back of her outdoor cage. The other pregnant women down the line of cages called out to her. Alice didn't answer, but just breathed through the cramping that indicated nothing other than the stress of the day. Someone rattled a metal sword against the bars of one of the other cages and shouted the women down with all sorts of slurs he would have never used in front of his mother in earlier days. Alice stayed where she squatted and leaned. Tobias Merck bent down close. Wait, I skipped a line, I'm sorry. They placed stew and water through the bottom of the cages. The other four women ate ravenously as the men laughed. Alice stayed where she squatted and leaned. Tobias Merck bent close to the locked door and leered in a black-toothed grin. One of his eyes was milking over with blindness and probably some disease that rooted in his nether regions. You should eat. If we're keeping you alive because you were two, then you should stay healthy as long as you might. Her eyes slid slowly open and then back closed. You sailed with us. You fought with us. You learned from him, and then you betrayed him, Merc. Tobias waved her off even though she wasn't looking. No one was ever truly with the mad captain. He was as liable to cut your throat over dinner as to laugh at your joke. You're better off without him, and so is your pup there. You were better off before you made yourself my enemy, she said. He snorted as he stepped away from her cage. You do well not to talk like that. Keeping you alive is more trouble than holding your head under the surf. Enjoy your dinner, widow. Go tell your master I'd like to speak with him, you one-eyed dog. He muttered a series of words much more insulting than widow, but he went along. Alice glanced over her shoulder as she slipped a long, sharp blade wrapped in a patch of leather from under the girth of her swollen belly. She unfolded the leather and ran the blade through her pan of stew. It took an effort for her to rise to her feet, even with the help of the bars. From there she fed some of the brown gravy into the lock. She dipped the blade a few more times and started painting between the edges of the gate and cage. What are you planning, Alice? Meredith asked from the next cage over. Revenge, she said, bloody and quick for most, slow and dirty for a few. Ruth spoke from 2 cages over and said, I'd have saved my stew for escaping if I knew it would help. I was just so hungry, Alice. I'm sorry. Talia and Sherry expressed their sorrow from the last 2 cages as well. Save it, Alice said as she pasted the hinges in stew with the last of the dying light. Just keep an eye and tell me when any of them are coming. How will we get out? Meredith asked. Alice inspected the caked hinges and said, Are you in killing moods, or would you rather I come back for you when it's done? The women, each to a person, growled out their desire for blood. Alice shushed them as she wet the blade in stew again. All right, then. The first man I kill will be the one holding the keys tonight. Be ready. She started tinkering with the lock. Less than a minute later, 2 of the women clicked their tongues, while another made a whispery sound like she was calling a cat. Alice waddled to the back of her cage, sat with effort, covered her knife in leather, and hid it under her belly. Jameson Stork rounded Alice's cage and crossed his arms. He stood a ways away from the bars. Maybe he respected the danger she offered. I heard you had some complaints, lady. Is it the seasoning, the accommodations, or do you think the madman you were married to deserved any better? I heard you all a-clucking like angry little hens as I approached. She stared up at him with half-open lids. "You asked for me, Alice, so out with it. Are you on a hunger strike? I'll save you some time by assuring you no one here or in any civilized city across the waters cares a bit if you starve yourself. I know what you are and what you have done. Getting yourself pregnant doesn't change any of that." "Why did you bother then?" she asked. "Why keep us alive while you kill even the boys? You complaining girl, if it doesn't suit you, tell me which of these hens you want cut open before your eyes first, and we'll get started." A few of the women in the other cages let out high, shrill whimpers. Alice hoped that was all for show, because there was hard work ahead. The womanly sound seemed to satisfy the captain. He smiled wide enough to show the gaps in his teeth. "Just don't understand your pretense at civility," she said. "If you don't understand the code by now," he said, "you're as hopeless as he was, and you'll meet the same end soon enough. As for the boys, they were pirates under the mad captain's banner. They stopped being boys long ago. Some of your crew sailed under that banner as well, Stork." He took a step forward, and Alice tensed. She didn't need him feeling the goo around her cage door. That they did, but when a man sees the light on his own, salvation is possible, the good book says. He reached for the bars, and she sprung to her feet at great cost and pain and weariness. As sweat broke out on her forehead, she held low on her large belly. Jameson Stork staggered back a few steps and never touched her bars. Now she smiled. "Never trust a snake," he said. "You may be on your way out, but you still have some venom. Don't forget it," she said. He rounded her cage wide, and she followed him with her eyes. "Relax," he growled at her. "Enjoy your stew. Made it from your animals. I didn't put your husband in it like some of the men who once sailed under his banner suggested. You're welcome, lady." She watched him until he was gone. Then she brought the knife out from under where she held her belly. As she slathered the blade in stew again, she went to work on the lock and door. Alice said, "This time only one of you give the signal. Even these idiots will catch on if we're all chirping." She just about had the tumblers in place when Meredith clicked her tongue. Alice slid down the bars beside her door. If she stayed close to it, they would stay back. It was a fellow she did not recognize. He was young, but not as young as the cabin boys Stork's men had killed. Keys jingled from the fellow's belt. Alice met eyes with Meredith, and they nodded at one another. The kid was too lively. He seemed wide awake as he alternated from staring dreamily over the water and watching the women too closely. In the late hours, the young man was relieved by a sleepier and drunker Lucian Cable. He was also a former sailor of Mad Red Crimson's crew. He accepted the keys from the kid, belched, placed the ring on a rock a few feet away from Alice's cage, and sat down in the middle of the ground with his back to the women. The kid looked back and forth from his relief to Alice. She did her best to look defeated and uninterested. Finally, the kid decided to leave. Lucian mumbled to himself about not being paid, not finding treasure, not getting enough plunder, and missing his sleep. Never once did he mumble he was sorry for betraying the Crimsons, and Alice didn't forget it. As his head lulled, she drew her knife from hiding, lubricated with the cold stew, and went to work on the door. He shifted in his sleep, but she never stopped. The lock wouldn't give, so she went to work on the hinges. The stew helped as she ruined her knife, twisting the hinges out one by one. The lock did snap with a quiet, wet pop once she pushed the gate outward without the hinges. The slathering of stew caused the door to slip the rest of the way free without a sound. She gritted her teeth through the effort and leaned the gate against the outside of her cage. The other women rose to their feet and watched as Alice stalked up on Lucian Cable's slumped form. She examined her chipped and dirty knife. Then she reached to Lucian's side and drew the ivory-handled dagger he had taken off a better man years ago. Lucian did not wake until she almost finished her cut from one ear to the other. As he choked and tried to flail away from the pain, she leaned her weight on her hand against the back of his head. It kept his dying gurgles muffled and prevented him from getting any leverage to fight. He sure did sound sorry now. Alice leaned low beside one of his ears that stretched with multiple rings in the lobe. She whispered, and her breath raised gooseflesh over his skin even as he died. "This will end all your useless muttering, you waste of a man." That was the final judgment Lucian Cable heard in his life as he sunk into the darkness of death. As Alice Crimson stood slowly, Lucian's corpse remained slumped exactly as he was in life. There was no difference between before and after his end, and that pretty much summed up his existence. Alice retrieved the keys and unlocked Meredith's cage. Meredith kissed Alice on her sweaty cheek and took the keys from her to free the others. The pregnant women gathered around their leader, and Alice whispered, "Weapons." They moved forward, and Alice signaled to the left with the ivory-handled blade she now carried. The women moved that way, and Alice circled wide, alone, from wagon to wagon. She stopped near a porch that used to be the cottage of Ruth and her man. The porch still stood attached to one blackened and blistered wall. The rest of the cottage was ash and ruin. Alice seethed with anger at Shy Tempest, the man who slept in a chair propped against the burnt wall. He was another traitor, and very recent at that. But what truly angered Alice was that her husband had lost to a crew too stupid to keep from burning their own shelters in a conquered land. They were too ignorant to live, too idiotic to celebrate victory. Alice walked right up to the porch steps, letting them creak and pop. Shy shifted in his sleep, but did not alert awake. No, because men trained their sleeping ears for stealth. If someone showed no reason to hide themselves, it did not trigger fear as easily or as swiftly. Alice took out her ruined blade and stabbed hard up under Shy Tempest's chin. His eyes flew open and he flailed his arms, but she held him tipped back against the wall. She also angled herself so the dying fires deeper in the camp showed her face clearly to him. She leaned in close and said, "You are no pirate. You are not even a man. You were dead the moment you sailed for this shore." Alice rammed the other blade up to its ivory hilt in his ear. He convulsed and thrashed a little, but finally settled into death. She withdrew the ivory-handled knife, but left the ruined blade buried up into his skull from underneath. She used the handle of the abandoned knife to bring his chair back to all four on the floor, and eased his body down off the seat to the porch boards, where he bled into the dark gaps. Alice took a couple more blades and a pistol off of Shy's body. She waved a bloody blade up into the scant light. The women saw it and moved to her out of the shadows. Blood dripped onto her dress and one cheek. She distributed the weapons. Then Alice pointed at the gun and put her finger over her lips. Cherry nodded her understanding. As Alice brought her finger away from her face, she had painted her mouth with a mix of with the mixed blood of Lucian and Shy. They turned to go deeper into their ruined village, and Alice absently licked the salty taste from her lips. She had not eaten dinner, and the flavor of the blood made her stomach roll with hunger. Much of Stork's crew lay about on the ground sleeping. Alice moved from one to the other, sticking them like bugs, twisting the blade inside their brains, and walking on to the next without waiting for the others to finish dying. Soon the women were fully armed. Alice carried a sword with a curved blade, along with her dagger. She tied off a sash above the top of her belly and between her breasts. She used it to hold 3 loaded weapons for later. As the women slipped in and around the structures where men slept off the stolen rum they drank too much of, the dead village was fertilized in more spilled blood. As they moved toward a surviving cottage at the far side of the camp where a fire still flickered within a ring of rocks, the kid who had served first watch stepped out of the trees, still tying up his pants from where he had relieved himself. He stopped cold and stared into the bloody faces of the armed mothers. His eyes grew wider and wider. Alice whispered, "Don't, lad." He turned and ran toward the light, screaming over and over alarm. Alice drew back the hand holding the ivory handle and hurled the blade end over end. The pommel struck him in the back of the head instead of the blade's point. That wasn't as she intended. As the dagger fell away in the grass, he yelped, but returned to screaming his alarm. A pistol shot cracked off in the night. The kid's skull came apart, and he dropped his pants around his knees as he pitched forward to the ground and relieved himself a little more in his death. Alice looked at Cherry, who held the smoking gun. Cherry shrugged, and Alice nodded back, pulling a pistol of her own to replace the dagger. Men scattered into the light. The women planted themselves in the path with their legs braced wide apart. For the ones further along in their pregnancies, it was actually more comfortable. They took careful shots and wasted very few of the rounds as they brought the men down one after the other. As a few of the invaders started to shoot back once they figured out where the attack was coming, the women split up and moved into the shadows. A few frightened men charged into the women's killing zone as they tried to flee to their skids along the shore. To a man, they were cut down by blades taken off their fellows. Each woman took the time to turn the men's dying eyes, up into their killers' faces, so they would know they were bested by women. A few men grouped together and made their way through the trees. From her cover, Alice saw Captain Jameson Stork and crewman Tobias Merck among the group. "They're getting away," Meredith said. Alice shook her head. "Take Cherry and follow behind them. Waste a few shots to drive them on, but do not get close or let them double back on you. Send the others with me to cut them off." Alice moved through the ruins without waiting for the others. Shots rang out as she navigated the switchback trail down the cliffs to the beach. Across the water, the anchored ship that Jameson Stork had named Blackbird Glory started to light up with the lanterns of the small crew left aboard. Sadness welled up in Alice's chest as she thought she might not get a chance to kill them all. Two men rose from the small boats along the shore. "Who goes?" one of them asked with a shaky voice. They're all dead. You need to flee," she said. They exchanged a look, and then the other said, "Come no closer. If you don't leave now, you will be dead too." One man looked back and forth while the others started to push one of the skids out from the sand. Alice cut one and then the other. As they both recoiled, she stood between them and stabbed one and then the other. They fumbled for their weapons, and she alternated, wounding them deeper and deeper with each strike. They fell to their knees, then their sides, before she left them be. Ruth and Talia walked out on the sands as the cries of the last men echoed over the water from the top of the cliff. Alice motioned to the boat, and the others smiled as they climbed inside and laid down low. Jameson headed the group as they made their way down to the sand. They kept looking over their shoulders as they approached the boats. Alice pulled back the hammers on two weapons, but carefully fired them one at a time. She did not aim on Jameson nor Tobias. When she opened fire, the other two joined in. The men turned and fired on the cliffs instead of the boats. They fell and cried as they perished. Tobias lost a kneecap with Alice's final shot from hiding. Cherry and Meredith crossed the sand as Jameson Stork fled along the beach. He turned back with two weapons and pulled both triggers. They clicked empty, so he dropped them. Alice stood while the other women silenced the crying men. She stalked behind Tobias Merck as he dragged himself along the beach away from her. He mumbled over and over, "Wait, no wait." Tobias held a palm out at Alice Crimson like that could stop her. She stabbed through the soles of his boots and he whimpered. She slashed and removed a couple fingers from the extended palm. He rolled to his stomach and cried into the sand. She opened both his kidneys through his back. Using the point of one of her knives, she pinned down his tongue inside his open mouth to silence him. Alice held her stomach as she leaned close to his ear. "You were dead the day you turned on us. You've been on borrowed time ever since. Now I'm collecting." He whimpered, and she opened his throat before stepping over him. He watched her walk along the beach behind the captain as Tobias himself died slower than he expected. Cherry leveled a weapon and fired it into the sand to the left of Jameson Stork. He waded out into the water and clambered up the broken dock that still stood in sections a little further out. Alice turned toward him as he climbed up the side of the wreckage of the feared and respected ship, the Crimson Bloodshed. Alice stepped from pillar to pillar in the water because she knew where they were. She climbed up the side of the ship as well, but slipped through a hole in the hull instead of sticking her head over the side. She heard Jameson's boots thump on the deck above her. Alice navigated the stairs from level to level. She walked through her husband's cabin, ignoring the things that had scattered across the floor with all the spilled memories they held, globes and maps from around the world, a crank machine that played music, and 1,000 other trinkets from across their years together cluttered the floor. She used the secret door behind the bookcase and walked out onto the deck. Jameson swung a sword at her neck, but she ducked and sidestepped. In the second it took him to pull the blade free from the fine wood, she had retreated out of range across the tilted deck. The first rays of morning sun cut over the top of the cliff behind her and lit the severed heads hanging from the ropes above. She knew her husband was among them, but she wouldn't look. Jameson Stork waved up with his blade and smiled at his gapped grin. "Anyone you recognize, dear?" She squared her feet and said, "I only see dead men." "Should have been more dead women I see now." She shrugged. "You might as well surrender. The last of your crew is leaving you." He only ventured a quick look over his shoulder before returning his attention to her. It was enough to see the skeleton crew had pulled anchor and was sailing away without him. "Well, you can't find good men anymore," he said. "I can't plead my belly like you did, and I don't trust you with the code of surrender. I'm going to kill you no matter what, sir." He licked his remaining teeth and shook his head. "Well, let's make sport of it, shall we? Sword to sword, captain to captain. One of us dies and the other walks away. I don't like my odds, but I respect a challenge and a worthy opponent, Captain Crimson." She lifted a pistol instead of her sword and shot him in the groin. He doubled over and collapsed to the deck. His sword slid a couple feet away from him. Alice dropped the empty weapon and fired with another into his right shoulder just in case. As he screamed and cried, she rolled him with her foot off the side with a crash into the compromised dock below. Alice climbed down slowly. Jameson Stork tried to crawl over the side of the dock to drown himself. Alice took him by the collar and dragged him toward shore. As she stepped from pillar to pillar, he choked below the waves. The other women helped her drag him out on the sand. From there, they took turns taking him apart piece by piece. As afternoon approached, Meredith broke away to gather supplies to cook a nice lunch for them all on the beach. They ate and talked among themselves about the future as Captain Stork groaned in the sand nearby. After eating and refreshing themselves, they returned to skinning him alive. Not much else got done that day, but this was important and needed to be done well. Before nightfall, they took down the heads of their men and buried them. They left Jameson Stork's mutilated body along with his men to be finished off by the night scavengers from out of the tide. The women returned to their village above the bloody beach. They shared the last standing cottage in their final days on that shore, but they set about building a new ship from the old. This small patchwork ship would be called Crimson Vengeance. When she caught up with Blackbird Glory, Alice planned to rename it Alice's Wrath. There was more business to finish beyond the horizon.